I'm Michelle Shingler, the editor-in-chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today, we're speaking with Shaun Bythell, the owner of the bookshop in Wigtown, Scotland, whose latest book, Remainders of the Day, released on December 6th. Shaun, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure, and I've just spotted something on your bookcase. It's Here I Am. I have a signed copy of it from when he was in Edinburgh.
Yeah, you mentioned one of his books in your book.
Yeah, Everything's Illuminated. It's a brilliant book.
Yeah, it's great. So with the journals, did you begin keeping the bookseller diaries with their eventual public consumption in mind?
No, in fact, it was kind of the opposite, because everybody who'd worked in the shop had more or less said that so many interesting things happen that you could write a book about it. And my partner at the time, I was talking to her about it and thinking, God, maybe it's something I could do when I retire, if I retire. And she said, yeah, but your memory is so bad that the only way you'll ever be able to do it is if you keep a daily note of what's happened. So I thought, oh, okay, well, it's a diary. And so that it just sort of came about just because I've got such a bad memory. And even now, I cannot remember what happened yesterday, but I do every day, I keep the diary up to date. And the diary format's it's quite an easy format to write, particularly if you, like me, you don't have any imagination. So I just write down what happens. It's as it happens. It's pretty easy.
So often when you go to look at book collections for purchase, you find that they've been poorly cared for. How should lay collectors care for their books to prevent their eventual harm?
Yeah, I read that question earlier when you messaged me, and I think probably the best way to look after books, it's annoying when you come across a book collection and they're good books that are damp or the mice have eaten whatever. But I think the best advice is to look at your book collection behind you, keep them like that, keep them dry, keep them not too warm, not too cold. Extremes of temperature tend to cause massive damage, particularly when books have been when there's been glue used in the manufacture of the books. So they just tend to curl and split, and but yeah, stable temperature and dry. That's the best way to look after books.
So you have an entire bookstore beneath you, so you can choose any book you want anytime you want. Has this impacted your personal book collecting?
Well, that's interesting, because I always think of myself that, and I think most booksellers will tell you there's a difference between readers and collectors. And I've always thought of myself as a reader. So I'm more interested in the content than the book as an object. Although obviously after 20 years in the trade, you can't help kind of veering slightly towards looking at books as commodities, and there are things that I try not to collect, but if you saw my bookshelf here, you'd laugh. It's just a mountain of things that I haven't read yet, but I intend to read. But yeah, sorry, I kind of lost track of the question there. I've gone a bit off piste.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, it's just about collecting, but that makes sense.
Yeah, so yes, I mean, my tastes are towards generally contemporary fiction, but increasingly I've kind of broadened them and tried to expand my horizons into things that I thought I wouldn't like sort of classic Russian literature and things, and actually I've discovered that I really like it. So when it comes to collecting, I think I tend to, even though I don't really collect books, the things I like are illustrated books. So particularly if it's a copperplate illustration, or even a woodcuts, anything like that, and also particularly landscapes. But there's also, if you and they're all dying off actually at the moment, the collectors of these things, but there was a golden age of particularly British illustration that had things like Peter Pan, illustrated by Arthur Rackham and Edmund Dulac, and there's just a whole, and Jesse M. King, there's just a whole raft of books that were illustrated by really, really amazing illustrators at around about the 1880s to 1920s. And I think those things are beautiful. Publishers on the whole tend, at the moment, with a few exceptions, tend not to really value illustrators as much as I think they ought to. And those books, like anything that was illustrated by Rackham or Dulac or Willie Pagani, are valuable now because of the illustrations, not because of the fact that they're a first edition or whatever. It's the illustrators brought value to those books.
Yeah. So you mentioned not having minded the quiet of the pandemic. How does a bookseller keep themselves occupied in a time of required shutdowns?
Reading. No, the pandemic was, for me, was actually was a really great time, because I think, and I think a lot of self-employed people will tell you the same thing. You don't really have holidays, and on the rare occasions when you do, all you think about is work and what you're going to have to go back to. So to actually be forced to close for several months takes all that pressure away. And I have it's a big house, and I have a garden, and we live near the beach, so it was kind of great. It was, but it did give me. We had at the time, my daughter was had just turned 1, so there was a lot of looking after her involved, which was also great. I really enjoyed that. But we did end up watching lots of Netflix series and reading lots of books. So all the things that I dream of doing when the shop's open, I was actually able to do because it was closed.
So what books should people keep and what should they cull when they're just looking at their personal collections?
That's a very good question. I think you should be constantly culling, to make space for new books. And I don't know why people keep books. I mean, having said that, I'm looking at my own collection. But I think if you're going to read something again, maybe keep it. But otherwise, just keep it moving. It should be a sort of organic. I always think book collections should be slightly like accordions, where they just kind of expand and contract and squeeze, and you're always, something new's always coming out of it. So, but yeah, I mean, I have to say, it is very difficult if you've read a book that you absolutely love to not just keep it on your shelf, but then it just becomes decoration unless you're going to go back to it. So I've just read one of the I think the best book, possibly the best book I've ever read, or the one I've enjoyed the most, and I've given it away. As soon as I finished it, I gave it away because I thought, God, this is too good to keep. It needs to go out there for someone else to enjoy.
What was the book?
I don't know if you've heard of it or read it. I hadn't. I just came across it in a bookshop in London and picked it up and thought, this looks really interesting. It's a book called Heatwave by Penelope Lively.
Okay.
And it's brilliant. In fact,
That's it.
I've just done something which I'd never done before. And after I finished it, I wrote to her.
Yeah.
And I've never written to an author before. And I just wanted her to know. It's funny because I do get people do write to me, and it's amazing, possibly because my ego is so fragile. But I really, really appreciate it when people do write to me, particularly if they're saying something nice instead of something unpleasant. But yeah, it is really. I've had, I think, one of the most difficult things, because you feel really grateful but also really guilty at the same time, is when people have written to me and said like that their dying partner read one of my books, and it was the first time they'd seen them laugh in months, and you think, oh God, that's so sad. But also you kind of feel like you've hopefully done something good in a way. But that makes me sound like an egomaniac, sorry.
No, I don't think so. They're wonderful to read. My partner loves them as well, and he's convinced that he's going to come to Wigtown and work in a bookshop. And
Great, if he wants a job.
yeah, I keep telling him to look at the till numbers and to read more carefully. But speaking of that, so Wigtown seems to be the antithesis of what people think they know about independent bookstores in small towns. Can you talk a bit about how bookstores transform that town?
Yeah, I mean, it was, when I grew up here, it was, there was industry here, and then that collapsed in the 1980s, and so it went from a town of 1,000 people, nearly all of whom had jobs, to a town that just had basically no employment. So yeah, things went pretty quickly downhill, and shops closed and people left. So the whole Booktown project was came along, and I think in 1998 we became the Booktown. And it was, I at the time I remember thinking, oh God, is this really going to work? Is this going to revive the economy, the community, everything? But it has. It really has. And in about the most, well, for me, about the most positive way you could imagine. It's all about books and reading and culture. And really, if you live in a small town in a remote part of rural Scotland, and you can redefine your community on those terms, God, and have an economic recovery as well, then God, what more could you want?
Yeah. It's a fabulous town. We enjoyed spending time there and in your bookshop. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. The book is out everywhere. We hope people will pick it up and enjoy reading your hilarious stories. Fantastic. And thank you so much.
That's very kind of you.